Hello, everyone. Thanks for finding the time and attending today's first Rapyd Dev Talk. My name is Drew, and I look after developer relations here at Rapyd. Rapyd is a fintech as a service platform, an API-first company, and it allows anyone to build fintech applications on top of our full-scale API. So that said, our speaker today is Jordan McGee. Welcome, Jordan.
Thanks, Drew.
Jordan McGee is Principal Research Analyst for Customer Experience and Commerce, leading the coverage of the payments ecosystem at 451 Research, a part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. I've had the privilege to work with Jordan on this research throughout the year, and being in fintech myself now a while, I've only heard great things about Jordan and his passion for commerce and fintech. So that said, welcome again, Jordan. I know everyone is curious to hear what you have to say and share today about the state of the global fintech developer.
All righty. Well, thank you, Drew. And thanks to your company, Rapyd, for commissioning the research that we're about to jump into here. You know, if I go back to, I guess it was probably like mid-January when we first started discussing this project. I think our aim was kind of three things, right? It was to produce some fintech research that was interesting, that was useful, and that really hadn't been done before. And you know, for anyone familiar with market research, that's not exactly the easiest ask, but I think we accomplished it with this study. You know, what we decided to do was take a look at the fintech industry through the eyes of a group that I think is really at the heart of this ecosystem, but that, you know, probably not enough people are talking to. And that, of course, is the developer, right? We wanted to understand what developers are working on, what they saw as opportunities and challenges facing them, what tools and coding languages they're using, and generally, you know, what their overall satisfaction and outlook for fintech was like. And so the way that we went about the research is, you know, we went out into the field back in Q2, which, you know, is not all that long ago, but in some ways feels like a while ago at this point. And we talked to over 500 fintech developers across a bunch of different countries, right? We talked to developers in the US, the UK, Singapore, New Zealand, India, Hong Kong, Australia. So a good mix of respondents from the US, right, Europe, and of course from Asia Pacific. And we aim to get a bunch of different fintech categories into this particular study. I think we talked to developers across more than a dozen different categories, right? So we talked to developers at payment processors, you know, authentication and security startups, digital banks, money transfer providers, you know, companies building investment applications, and really everything in between. We also pulled in a bunch of different job titles, right? So, you know, job titles, of course, that had to do with the developer role. So things like front end and back end and full stack developers. We talked to systems admins, IT managers, systems and solutions architects, basically anybody that had a hand in either reading code, writing code, deploying code. And what we'll do here is jump into, you know, some of the key findings, some of the, you know, aha moments, if you will, that popped out of this study. And of course, you all have access to the full report that provides even more context on some of the findings that we walked away with. But just before we get into the results, I thought it'd be useful to kick us off with some data from 451's parent company, S&P Global, on the state of venture funding in fintech. And, you know, I'd say the good news for fintechs is that investors continue to be highly attracted to this segment. You know, this figure still kind of blows me away, right? Last year, we saw almost 18 billion in capital pumped into private US fintech companies, right? Just those that are headquartered in the US. That's up 20% year over year, up from just shy of about 15 billion in 2019. So last year, we saw 140 more funding rounds than the previous year. We saw just about 2 fintechs in the US get funded each day last year. And we saw activity all over the place, right? In payments, insurance, investment technology. Each of those 3 subsegments had over 150 transactions, over 4 billion in funding respectively. And again, that's just the US market. And what's interesting, right, is a lot of the factors that fueled fintech funding in 2020, they're still in place this year, right? Things like low interest rates, a fairly receptive market for exits, right? Things like IPOs and SPACs. Those factors are still in place, and we still see the funding continuing to accelerate. We're seeing that right now, especially in the payment service provider segment, So I just pulled this analysis together about a month ago. Looking at the first half of this year, we saw PSPs globally raise just over $5.5 billion. PSPs averaged more than one funding round per week. 14 of those rounds were in the 9-figure range or above. And actually, a lot of that funding went into Europe, right? 70% of the capital went to PSPs that were headquartered somewhere in Europe, including the UK, right? So point being, a tremendous amount of momentum in the funding environment, and that's in part helping to push this space forward. So that was one of the reasons that we were just so excited to understand, what do developers think of all this, and kind of how does the industry look, through their eyes. So I think a good place to start is to talk about the applications that fintech developers have worked on over the past year. And what we saw in the study was more than half, right? 56% of respondents said they'd been working on payment-related projects over the past 12 months. So that's anything from digital wallets to P2P apps, remittances, processing, right? Everything in between. We saw investing in digital banking also register as top areas of activity, right? 41 and 30% of developers respectively playing in those areas, but still a distant second and third behind payments. So why all the interest in payments? Well, I think in part because payments are essentially part of every fintech service, right? There's generally going to be some sort of pay-in, payout, or processing component to just about any type of fintech related application in the market. But I'd say that strong focus and kind of activity around payments also points to that broader trend that we're seeing play out right now where, hey, if you looked at payments 10 years ago, you might have said payments are a commodity, right? Payments are a cost of doing business. They're just sort of a necessary evil. You look at payments today, right? Enterprises are looking at it as more of a strategic lever. Right? How can we leverage payments to improve our customer experience or to drive growth or to help us expand into a new market? So I think that's another factor that is sort of leading to all this activity around payments at the moment from a development standpoint. And when we double click on some of the top payment projects that fintech developers have been engaged in, a lot of them tie back to those themes of driving growth, right? Enhancing the customer experience, improving payout processes, right? 36% of developers have been involved in that type of project over the past 12 months. Integrating local and alternative payment methods, a third of developers engaged in that area. Integrating payment gateways and processors, 32%, right? Had said that was a top project for them. So point being, activity everywhere, but especially in payments at the moment, really seeing a noted focus on building out a variety of different capabilities. So thinking about the opportunities and the challenges that developers see impacting their work. We saw some really strong interest in engagement with just general excitement around data and artificial intelligence, right? AI, and a few call outs on that front. We saw roughly 3/4 of respondents, I think it was 76%, say that AI and ML was the biggest opportunity they saw impacting their work. And that was universally the case across all of the age groups, all of the geographies that we tapped into. We saw data and AI initiatives rank as the top fintech project that developers have been recently involved in across all geographies, as we saw just called out on the previous slide there. More than 2 in 5 respondents said that they were involved in data and AI initiatives. And we also saw 2/3 of respondents say that they are most excited about the application of advanced technologies such as AI and ML when thinking about the future of this industry, right? The future of fintech. So it's interesting, right? Because AI has relevance across pretty much every area where fintech developers are playing, right? Where they're building applications. One of the more obvious opportunities is around, of course, security and fraud prevention, where we're seeing that today, right? AI is being applied to large data sets for identity networks and threat identification and prediction. And interestingly, right, we see on the left-hand side of the slide here, security and fraud prevention registered as the #1 challenge that fintech developers see impacting their organizations. There's also, of course, a story for AI in areas like process automation, right? Ensuring that developers are not bogged down by some of the more menial tasks that they have to deal with, so they can better prioritize their workload. So again, very interesting to see the excitement around AI and just how well it targets the top 3 challenges that we see developers citing in fintech. Another call out, or maybe a few more call outs on the opportunities front, real-time payments, right, ranks in the top 3, 63%. That of course is a reality across a good number of geographies today, right? We see that in India, we see it in Singapore, in the UK, Brazil, starting to come to life here in the US market through the clearinghouse and the Fed now, right, through the Federal Reserve by 2023. We see blockchain rank high as well, also 63%. And I think we'll continue to see excitement around the application of blockchain and fintech, especially as we see some of these Web3 initiatives beginning to take shape. Cryptocurrency, right, a bit further down the list there, 35%. I think if we fielded this survey today, it might be in the top 5. I just was at Money 2020, I was talking to Drew about this and was just blown away by the number of cryptocurrency companies that were in attendance at the event, making announcements, and just the general conversation, right, across everybody I was talking to, from the card networks to processors and even point of sale providers, right? Everybody's talking about crypto at the moment. So have to imagine if we field the same study next year, we'll see crypto creep up pretty close to the top 5, maybe even the top 3, just given the momentum around that ecosystem at the moment. Thinking about code, right? Interesting topic in the developer world. One of the more interesting findings for me was that nearly half of fintech developers work at companies where code is being deployed at least daily. 80% work at companies where code committed is running in production in under a week. And so the big message, I think, for any fintech company, or even an incumbent payment company or financial institution, right, is that if you're not keeping up with that pace, you're at risk of being left behind, right? Code is rapidly going into production in the fintech space. When it comes to the coding language preference, the results are a bit of a mixed bag, as we see on this chart here. We see roughly half, right, 52% of developers prefer either Python, C, C++, C#, or JavaScript. The remainder, it's a long tail, right? They prefer nearly a dozen other types of languages like Java or SQL, HTML. We saw that more experienced developers, this was also interesting, right? More experienced developers showed a stronger preference for Python, while less experienced developers showed a stronger preference for JavaScript. So, for example, 14% of respondents that had been coding for less than 5 years preferred Python, jumps up to 22% for those that have been coding for more than 10 years. If we look at it from the other direction, for JavaScript, 20% of those coding for less than 5 years prefer it, compared to just 10% for those that have been coding for 10 or more years. So that was quite interesting. In terms of the most frequently used coding languages at work, we saw Python, Java, and JavaScript, right, as indicated by the dark blue bar on the chart, rank in the top 3 across every geography in our survey. But a few other call outs here that are worth mentioning. We saw Python was used most frequently in the US by 40% of fintech developers, drops down to 26% in the UK, 30% in Asia. So again, definitely a mixed bag in terms of both preference and frequency of use as it relates to these different coding languages. Really no clear-cut leader that emerged, if you will. We also saw that most of the tools used by fintech developers are developed in-house or through a hybrid approach, just a little over a quarter, right? 26% said most of their tools are commercial off the shelf, right? COTS tools. My take is that this is in large part due to the regulatory complexity of the fintech ecosystem, given in-house development certainly allows for more control, right? More customization. And if we think about everything that goes on in the fintech space, right? Identity verification, KYC requirements, data governance, encryption, multi-factor auth, you name it, right? These are all examples of the regulatory requirements that many fintechs have to adhere to. And they also have to adhere to a variety of different third-party requirements, especially if you're connecting directly to the card networks, or even just interfacing with Visa and MasterCard in any way, right? There's compliance hurdles that you have to deal with. So, to me, these are factors that are throttling the adoption of COTS tools. And, not surprisingly, if you recall from an earlier slide, the number 2 type of project that fintech developers are most likely to be involved in just behind data and AI initiatives is addressing regulatory compliance requirements. The dark side of this, right, the dark side of limited adoption of COTS tools is that 83% of fintech developers told us they're spending time developing in-house tools. And actually, more than 2 in 5 say they're spending more time developing in-house tools than their other job responsibilities, right? So there are certainly benefits to in-house development, but too much of that relative to other job responsibilities starts to, pull resources away from the core business. And to me, that seems to highlight an opportunity for developer tools that are more specialized for the fintech industry and some of the requirements that fintechs must adhere to. And I think, the benefit of that, right, is developers can start to shift their focus back to the product, back to the core business, away from just developing tools. The timing of this survey was interesting, right? It went into the field at a time when vaccines were working their way into the general public across pretty much all the geographies that we surveyed. And we asked respondents to sort of reflect on how their work lives had been impacted by the pandemic. And as you can see, developers were not immune to the challenges that COVID-19 posed. We saw increased remote work, right, cited by 55% of respondents globally, working longer hours, cited by 46%, challenges maintaining workplace relationships, cited by 2 in 5, a reduction in compensation, cited by more than a third, right? These were things that clearly came out in the survey as challenges that faced developers during the pandemic. And just a few call outs here. If we look at the UK-based developers saw the biggest increase in working remotely, 6 percentage points above the average. And perhaps not coincidentally, right, they were also most likely to have experienced low morale, 11 percentage points above the average. If we look at APAC, we saw APAC-based respondents were most likely to be working longer hours. They were 7 percentage points above the average in that regard. And then if we think about this, from an age standpoint, we saw respondents under the age of 30 were most likely to have experienced low morale, 5 percentage points above the average, and a workforce reduction. If we look at older respondents, right, those above age 45, they were most likely to have found themselves working longer hours by a significant extent, right, 15 percentage points above the average. So, point being here, there's a lot to digest on this chart, but the impact of COVID was really seen across the board, right? Everything from, a reduction in force to drops in compensation to drops in productivity, right? There were no shortage of challenges from the pandemic. And it's interesting now looking at job satisfaction off the back of all these challenges. If we think about everything that, everybody in all industries went up against, but, certainly developers in the fintech space, we think about job satisfaction, overall reasonably high. We saw in a separate question, this is also positive, right? Nearly 9 in 10 respondents said they're optimistic about the fintech industry's growth over the next 5 years. So, I think generally a positive tone, but it is worth taking a look at the red and yellow, chunks of this bar here, where we saw a quarter of developers tell us, they're either somewhat or very dissatisfied with their current job, right? That means a good 1 in 4 fintech developers are potentially at risk of churning. And I think that ties in with this general theme we're seeing right now around the great resignation, right? Talent is increasingly on the move. People are thinking long and hard about what they want out of their role at work. They're thinking what industry they want to play in. They're thinking about, what matters most to them today more than ever. And in some cases, that means leaving their current job and looking for a new position, right? So if you're looking to hire or you're looking to retain, right, the objective is pretty much the same, right? You need to prioritize strategies to attract and to retain talent. And that's something that we took a look at in this survey, right? And we see some evidence of what is going to drive retention and talent attraction here, right? The most important benefits in the eyes of the fintech developer. A few things I'd call out here, right? It was interesting to see competitive salary came out way ahead of equity. 52% said competitive salary was the most important benefit. Just 19% said equity. So, potential takeaway here is that more fintech developers want the upfront guaranteed money. Flexible hours and remote work, also interesting to see those things out in front. Feels like perhaps a bit of a holdover from the pandemic. Developers realizing that the benefits of not being beholden to a 9 to 5 schedule and being forced into an office every day are good for their lives, right? And they want their job to be integrated into their life, not to work against it. So interesting to see those things come out strong. A few other call outs. If we look at the APAC market, respondents there showed the highest preference for a strong benefits package, while much fewer showed preference for tuition and course reimbursement, right? 7 percentage points below the average there. If we look at the UK, where, as we saw in an earlier slide, right, the percentage of respondents citing low morale was the highest, we saw the highest preference for flexible hours, 11 percentage points above the average. And then if we look at some of the age breakouts, we saw that respondents under the age of 30 showed a below average preference for remote work, actually 10 percentage points below the average. So, we see that in-person kind of in-office experience still resonates, right? Especially for younger developers. Another interesting call out, just 14% said free in-office meals were an important development. That's probably a topic of, great contention in Silicon Valley, but perhaps the message there is it's time to reallocate some of the funds used for these very elaborate lunches and breakfasts and meals throughout the day and shift that more towards salary and benefits. In a separate question, we asked fintech developers, what types of activities are you engaged in outside of work, right? What do you like to do outside of the job? And there we saw, they're largely oriented around community. We saw 43% said they're contributing to developer forums. 36% are engaged in volunteer tech projects. 28% are doing some sort of blog or newsletter. And just to double click on a few of those, we saw that GitHub and Stack Overflow ranked as the top communities where developers in the fintech space are using to stay up on payments and fintech trends, right? 71% using GitHub, 60% using Stack Overflow. And we also saw that 95% either currently or have previously been involved in open source projects. And actually of those, 83% have contributed to public repositories on GitHub in the last 12 months. So a final, somewhat encouraging note to leave you with here. We're seeing gender diversity among fintech developers showing signs of improvement. Developers age 30 and above, at least with this particular sample, we're much more likely to be male, especially in the 30 to 44-year-old bracket. We see evidence of that improving gender diversity in the up-and-coming cohort of fintech developers. Actually, the majority, right, 54% under the age of 30 who responded to this survey were female. And I think that could point to a possible shift underway in the demographic composition of the fintech developer workforce. And I think that's a trend, we can all agree will hopefully continue and continue to persist. So a few concluding thoughts to leave you with here. Very strong optimism for the sector through the eyes of the developer. Again, nearly 9 in 10 fintech developers optimistic about the growth of the fintech segment over the next 5 years. And we saw payments in particular incredibly active at the moment, right? As payments really start to work their way into just about every type of commerce or financial, increasingly even social experience that we see on the market today. If there's one concern I have walking away from this study, it's that about a quarter of fintech developers are expressing job dissatisfaction. Could be a factor of the challenges that COVID posed to employees of all industries, but I think it's further evidence of, again, this trend around the Great Resignation. Right, very important for companies to work hard to retain their talent, and we saw especially things like salary, benefits, flexible hours as high priority areas that that companies should be prioritizing to ensure that they're attracting the best talent in the developer ecosystem and also retaining the best talent. And finally, the reason that I found this study so important is because developers really are the future of this industry, out of the fintech segment. Any company that wants to effectively compete on the basis of delivering fintech experiences, they need developer talent, right? There's no workaround for that. So finding avenues to attract and motivate and retain developers really has become a critical success factor for just about every company today, right? In financial services and increasingly beyond. So with that, I thank you for your attention as we ran through some of the key findings here. I think we've got a bit of time for Q&A. So Drew, I will flip it back over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jordan. That was awesome. Really appreciate you speaking to that, and for everyone joining today on the call. We do have a question in chat. We'll just start with that. This is from Nestor. How can you reconcile the benefits of remote work with the demanding goals of fintech or a new company that you just started and have fewer resources when dealing with remote and highly liquid teams? Their mobility to other company is faster than before.
Sure. Let me try to pull out what I think that question was after. So, look, to me, I think remote work is with us forever. Will it be remote only? Probably not. I think we're going to continue forward with more of a hybrid environment. There's a couple ways to go about that, and I think one of the things that we're seeing increasingly, especially in the fintech space, is many of these earlier stage companies have started as remote only, but they are encouraging team building activities, right? So perhaps you're remote for a quarter, and then you go off and you have a week offsite or a multi-day offsite, right, for team building, for more of a kind of one-to-one, face-to-face type of engagement, which I think is still important. And we saw that come across, in this study, right, where that human interaction still matters, even if people are looking for more flexibility, even if people do increasingly want to spend the majority of their time at work from their home office. So the trend that I see is more towards hybrid. Will that mean you spend a few days in the office and you spend a few days at home, or you spend a full quarter at home and then you spend a few days at an offsite? That's probably going to vary from company to company, but I think that mix is still going to be important, so you still have kind of that human element of whatever project or initiative you're trying to build out.
Nice. And thanks for the question, Nestor. If anyone has any question, just drop it in the chat and we'll pick it up. There is another one here, Jordan. I'll ask, what's the most important trend you are seeing in payments right now?
Sure. To me, it's really the evolution of the distribution model for payments. And it's interesting if we think about, payments and kind of how payments have operated up until recent history. It's been about branches. It's been about ISOs. It's been about agents and feet on the street sales forces, right? Those were the primary conduits into the marketplace. Today, it's increasingly software companies, right? It's tech companies, it's SaaS companies that are embedding payments within their propositions, right? And there's so many companies you can point to in that regard, right? The likes of Shopify, vertical SaaS companies like MindBody. You see it increasingly with social companies, if you want to point to Facebook, or even on-demand economy companies, if you want to point to Grab or Uber. Increasingly payments are becoming part of the stack for just about every single company, and that's really changing the way in which payments are being not only delivered but also consumed by the end user, whether that's a consumer or a merchant. So that's really the biggest and kind of most impactful change I'm seeing, is just how payment companies need to go to market, and the importance of fintech developers, right, payment developers, for just about every single type of company today, right? It's no longer just merchants or just financial services companies. Increasingly, it's every type of company that needs to have some sort of developer talent specific to fintech to compete effectively.
Nice. So let's talk about buy now, pay later. Is this hype? Is it sustainable? What's your take?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic at the moment, and it's a trend that's not going to disappear. I think first it's important to note that while there has been so much conversation about buy now, pay later over the past 12 to 18 months, it's not a new trend, right? If we look at Brazil, credit cards have largely operated on the installment model for many years. If you look at Australia, New Zealand, the Nordics, right, buy now, pay later has been present for many years. It's finally working its way into markets like the US, and you're seeing a lot of those players that operate in other markets now starting to work into the US as well. Will this trend persist? I think yes. What will it look like in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? It's probably anybody's guess. The regulators are increasingly looking at the space. You're seeing that in the UK at the moment. I think the US is not too far off, right, from putting up some guardrails. It is a bit like the Wild West right now. And if you look at a lot of these buy now, pay later providers, what have they done at the end of the day? They've somehow made debt look sexy to the consumer. They've repackaged debt in a very consumer friendly way, and so I think that's something that the regulators are going to keep an eye on, and that could impact how this space evolves. But I see no shortage of activity, as it relates to consumer and merchant adoption. We saw in our surveys buy now pay later adoption on the consumer side more than double last year during the pandemic, and on the merchant front, it's an absolute land grab, and you're seeing a lot of these buy now pay later providers offer up some pretty attractive concessions to merchants just to get real estate on their checkout page. So the trend is here to stay, but again, I think it's going to evolve quite a bit, even in the short term, and it might look a fair bit different, next year at this time than right now.
Right. I've noticed some consolidation lately in some of the BNPL. What do you think is the reason behind that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I mean, you saw certainly Square and Afterpay. You saw PayPal go after it was a Japanese provider called Paydi.
Right.
I think it points to a few things. I mean, one, to me, buy now pay later looks a little bit more like a feature than it does a standalone business. So in some ways, these buy now pay later providers almost do need to get acquired and get integrated into a broader value proposition. I think it also points to the fact that everybody feels like they need to have a buy now pay later capability, right? Whether you're a card network or a payment processor or some other fintech provider, maybe even a neobank. Buy now pay later is kind of one of the tools that you have to have in the tool belt increasingly. So I think there's that element as well. And yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think that the M&A in this space is going to slow down just because there's so many providers. I think at last glance, we did an analysis. There was over 80 buy now pay later
Wow.
providers operating globally. So it's a very busy space at the moment.
Cool. So that's all the questions. There's none other in chat, and I haven't had any else handed to me. So does anyone have any questions they want to ask? I think we have a couple of more minutes. If we just wanted to open up the mics. Does anyone have a question they'd like to personally ask Jordan?
Hi, Jordan. This is Kathy. How are you?
Hi, well, thanks.
So quick question. With all the conversations that you've had with developers, they're an incredibly busy lot. There's so much happening with them at any given point in time. And, then there is us, who are trying to provide value to developers. What would be the best ways to kind of engage with them, communicate with them in a way that feels organic rather than yet another company trying to market to them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think and I'll go back a couple slides here just to put this up here, this one here. So it was interesting to me to see some of the different avenues that developers are kind of participating in their community outside of work, right? So things like developer forums are very important. Things like being engaged in volunteer tech projects, even things like participating in newsletters to some degree, offering their insight, right? Perhaps as part of a broader newsletter. Those all seem like interesting inroads to me, right? Whether you're able to reach them through a forum, right, where they're actively participating, whether you yourselves have a newsletter, right,
Mhm.
that you're providing and inviting developers to perhaps contribute to that, to offer their insights, their perspectives. If you're perhaps spearheading a volunteer initiative, right, as it relates to the tech ecosystem, right, looking for collaboration around that. I think are interesting and kind of perhaps more organic ways to start the conversation.
Mhm.
Drew, I don't know. I mean, you kind of sit in the seat a bit more directly.
Yeah.
Anything that you'd offer up there?
No, I totally agree, Jordan. I think it definitely has to be at a more organic scale. It has to be developers are looking for trust more than anything.
Right.
So I think whatever you say has to be authentic and delivered to them and go to them, right? Like Jordan said, like the forums, the newsletters, but mainly like the forums. Give them a community, give them a place to go, give them some place to talk amongst themselves, get advice, and then they can also use that at the very beginning of their journey when they're looking for a provider or someone to work with. They can then use that historical data basically to look at and say like, all right, well, I see what this company's doing. Now let's go see what this other company's doing and kind of do their own little quick analysis on the feedback, on what people's, sentiment is, what the questions is, are people answering, with direct, are they giving them, links to the right information that they can then go quickly get started. Because I think that's the biggest part, is getting the developer up to speed and started with your, in this case, an API or a low-code solution, is probably paramount for them, because their time, like we've seen, is very important.
Absolutely.
Cool. Any other questions? Nice. Okay. Well, that said, thank you, Jordan, once again. This has been great. Really appreciate your time and going through the research. We also care about those on the call, that your point of view. There's a short survey. I'm going to send an email out probably later on today, maybe tomorrow. We'll see. And in that, there will be a survey that you can fill out. You can let us know some of the questions that were asked. You can kind of tell us what some other subject matter is you'd like to talk about in these Rapyd Dev Talks. You can also, we're going to post this video on our community, so you can come in there and continue the discussion. It doesn't have to stop here, and you can keep asking your questions, just making comments about it. So again, thanks for attending today's Rapyd Dev Talk. Connect in our community, which is community.rapyd.net. And be sure and join us December 14th, where we'll have our next Rapyd Dev Talk, 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know, with Kevin Henney. Excited for that one. And if you have any additional questions, again, community@rapyd.net, those come directly to me, and I'm happy to work with you, provide any information you might need or additional support. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.